Now, but yeah, I mean, that was just the last question. And I mean, it's funny that you would have to obviously honestly, not really. I mean, really, like a few. There's one of the questions.
But we can all figure out what our internal navigational. There's reserved seating in the front if you will.
It said like 3, 4, 5 points.
Good morning. I'm Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy here at the Brookings Institution, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our inaugural Tony Judt Lecture on Europe. Today, Europe is facing profound internal and external challenges. Russia's war of aggression against neighboring Ukraine continues unabated, and despite Western support to Kyiv, the outcome of the war is uncertain. Other developments, including tumultuous politics in European states, the upcoming U.S. presidential elections, and the rise of China, have generated new strains as well as new opportunities for U.S.-European political, economic, and security ties. The magnitude of these challenges demand thoughtful conversations to inform policy debates on today's Europe and its relationship with the United States. And that is precisely what we hope to accomplish with the establishment of the Tony Judt Lecture on Europe. This lecture will serve as the flagship event for our Center on the United States and Europe, which celebrates its 20th anniversary this year. The lecture honors Tony Judt, one of the finest thinkers on these topics, who passed away too young in 2010. A professor at New York University and the founder of NYU's Remarque Institute, Judt authored many books, including the magisterial Postwar, A History of Europe Since 1945. 19 years ago, just after that book came out, he spoke from this stage here at Brookings. I'd like to acknowledge his wife, Jennifer Homans, and his children, Daniel and Nicholas, who are joining us today online. We could think of no better speaker to launch this undertaking than Charles King, Professor of International Affairs and Government at Georgetown University, an expert on comparative politics and international affairs, and an award-winning author. Several of his books, along with several of Professor Judt's books, are available in the Brookings Bookshop. Following his remarks, Charles will engage in a brief conversation with my colleague Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is the director of our Center on the United States and Europe, as well as the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations here at the Brookings Institution. Constanze spearheaded the effort to launch this lecture, and we thank her and the CUSE team for everything that they've done to make this happen. Charles and Constanze will be later joined on stage by a panel of distinguished experts. As we begin, I'd like to thank the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future for their generous commitment of support for this inaugural lecture. We are grateful for the support of all of our funders to Brookings, not only for making our work possible, but for their abiding respect for our research independence. Please note that we're currently streaming live and on the record. We'll be taking questions from viewers, which can be submitted via email at the email address events@brookings.edu or via social media using the hashtag US and Europe. I'd like to now welcome Charles King to the stage to deliver the inaugural Tony Judt Lecture.
Thanks very much, everyone, and thank you so much to Constanze and the members of the center and staff, the fellows, for inviting me to be with you today. I also want to acknowledge members of Tony's family who are joining us. It's an incredible honor for me to be in this position. I didn't know Tony well, but in the years I did know him, he had a profound impact on my life and my career. I happened to be part of the inaugural class, I think the first class of those Kandersteg seminars back in 2006, which are still going and are an institute that became a kind of institution where younger scholars of Europe could meet each other, talk, learn from each other. And when I look at the list of alumni who have come through those seminars over the years, you see many of the key figures I still read today and learn from on how to think about European history and current affairs. So I'm very grateful to be in this position and humbled by it. My title today, Political Ideas in the 21st Century, you will recognize as a complete crib from Isaiah Berlin. Because Isaiah Berlin was asked in 1950 to kind of take stock of where the world was at that time by the editors of Foreign Affairs. And he wrote an essay called Political Ideas in the 20th Century in response. And Berlin was in a particularly good position to do a mid-century stock-taking. He was a former child refugee from the Bolsheviks. He was a biographer of Marx. He was a Jewish witness to the rise of Nazism, as well as a witness to the kind of casual prejudices of an Oxford common room. So he knew firsthand the consequences of ideas in the world. But his take on where the world was in 1950 was a bit unconventional, because he saw the world as divided not between capitalists and communists, or a sphere of freedom and one of unfreedom, or places that kind of prized liberty versus those that prized obedience and order. He saw the dominant political ideas of the 20th century entirely differently. The great divide, he said, was not between left and right, but between certainty and skepticism. The struggle of his own time, he thought, was how to preserve the kind of creative power of doubt in a world that seemed to be full of ready-made answers to all of the problems of human existence. For Berlin, the 19th century, he thought, was very different. The 19th century was a place where the great problems of human life, the great problems of life together, how do we organize a country? What does the nation mean? How do we define the nation? Should government be big or small? What should government claim to do in our lives? What claims do we have on government? All of these, he thought, were questions that people argued over, fought over, debated, and applied reason and virtue to try to solve. But as he saw it in 1950, all of that had disappeared before two twin certainties. The Nazism that had just been defeated, the idea that all of the problems of the world would go away in a racially purified state, create a racially pure political entity, and everything else gets reduced to technique, to technical problems of efficiency. You solve the problems of the world rather than debating them, dealing with them, trying to live with them. And on the other hand, of course, Stalinism, that a world that is cleansed of class conflict will be a world in which all of the great problems of human existence likewise fade into history. Berlin was, as you know, philosopher, political theorist, Oxford Fellow, but also a great talker, a great conversationalist. And he was incredibly interested in the way, perhaps most interested in all of his ideas, of how people make sense of history in a given place and time. What worldviews do they have? What are the dominant metaphors that they use? How does common sense, a local sense of common sense, shape the way we see the world? And that's what he was trying to map, if you like, in 1950. Map the world as he saw it, one that was in much greater need of skepticism, doubt, uncertainty than he felt was on offer. Many of you will recognize those ideas, of course, at the time as not being unique at all to Berlin. For all of their many, many differences, other writers like Friedrich Hayek or Karl Popper or Hannah Arendt saw the real canyon in politics at mid-century as running between pluralists and anti-pluralists. They were, in a word, liberals of an old-fashioned variety, trying to make sense of two different kinds of illiberalism that they had witnessed in their own time, Stalin's and Hitler's. They wanted to figure out how a liberal outlook on the world, individuals over groups, people over states, freedom over conformity, rules over fiat, had been brutally overturned by these twin tyrannies. And of course, as Tony would later argue, it was the societies that emerged after the end of the Second World War, the welfare states of Western Europe, the integrated European Union, even the United States, which Tony took an increasing interest in, of course, as his career went on, something approaching a kind of multiracial democracy after 1965. All of these were backstops, as Tony saw it and as many of these other thinkers saw it, against those certainties of the 1930s and 1940s returning. This was the famous argument about what the Harvard philosopher, political theorist Judith Shklar called the liberalism of fear, a liberalism that comes from the idea of building backstops against the return of those certainties. In many ways, that idea, Berlin's idea, kind of won out. Post-war liberalism, in many ways, triumphed after the time when Berlin was writing this essay. But to the degree that it did, to the degree that liberalism became a dominant way of seeing the world, if not immediately after the Second World War, then after 1989 and 1991, what Tony increasingly worried about is that it was suffering from its own brand of complacency, its own brand of self-satisfaction, the old valuing of uncertainty now replaced with a kind of triumphalist self-satisfaction. Tony himself warned here at Brookings in his own lecture in 2005, a month after the publication of Postwar, we've lived, most of us in this room and most Europeans today, for too long in a post-ideological, or if you like, a post-political era, he said. We've forgotten what it was like before, how fragile the Western consensus of the past few decades could so easily prove. Well, Tony, of course, foresaw the ascendancy of Donald Trump and Viktor Orban and Vladimir Putin because he was the kind of student, he was a student of the kinds of societies that had produced this type of person already in the last century. But there was a key difference in this regard between Tony and Berlin. Because Tony came of age in a society that had faith that those old demons had been more or less exorcised. Tony was a product of the self-satisfied version of the world that Berlin was trying to describe decades earlier. That faith, Tony believed, was deeply in error. As he put it in his own lecture, we've forgotten what ideological politics were like. So what I want to do briefly in the time remaining is to try to describe to you what I think the return of ideological politics means, the kind of thing that Tony was looking at into the future a couple of decades ago, and then to go through how we might rescue a liberal version of pluralism, a liberal pluralism for this new ideological age. To begin, I think we're in a moment when ideological politics, the contest of ideas in politics, has come roaring back. At no point since the 1940s have the contrasting ideas at stake in political debate in both the United States and Europe been so absolutely evident, nor have they been so much alike in Europe and the U.S. They're kind of like isobars on a meteorologist's map connecting high and low pressure fronts. The Atlantic is very much part of a single political weather system. From 4 years ago, Black Lives Matter, that energized communities not only across the United States but also across Europe. The spread of terms like anti-colonialism or settler colonialism or indigeneity, which are now as likely to be used on an American college campus as by young people in Ireland or Ukraine or Georgia. American political theorists and commentators make common cause with the European nationalist right and see them as confreres in a new struggle against a woke left. Just as at the same time we know that Russian intelligence officials have sought inroads with anti-racist or the anti-Zionist left in the United States. Figures like Nigel Farage or Viktor Orban regularly speak at Republican conferences in the United States. And in Orban's case in particular, and of course Budapest now hosts its own CPAC conference. There's a CPAC Budapest that's been in operation since 2022, casting Hungary as a kind of future America in a way, that Hungary is evidence of what a kind of Christian reconquista might yet achieve in the United States. As Orban put it at the CPAC Budapest conference this year, quote, "The adherents of the old world are still sitting there in Brussels, and I'm afraid they're sitting there in Washington too. This year we set out to chase them away so that the era of sovereignty will finally come." And he was talking about the European elections. He ended that speech by saying, "Go Donald Trump, go European sovereigntists." So how do we make sense of all of this? What does all of this mean? Well, I think the easy account is to kind of repeat Berlin's analysis in a way, to defend a liberal pluralist outlook as a kind of neutral space between twin extremes. And there's an entire shelf full of books now by liberal theorists that do exactly this, that position liberalism, and defined in many ways by different writers, as a kind of plural, ad hoc, imperfect, conversational, middle-of-the-ground worldview between twin intolerances, to give them a label, the woke on one side, the folk on the other. So pluralism seems to be threatened by this new form of self-satisfied certainty, and if we were to make that argument, Berlin might sort of nod his head and agree with us, with these challenges coming from the progressive left as well as the radical right. And you only need to keep your own vocabulary list of terms on both the nationalist right in the United States or Europe and the progressive left to see that we're dealing with a vocabulary that is not shared across that divide, but is congealed on either side of that divide. Christian nationalism, post-liberalism, settler colonialism, intersectionality, white privilege, anti-racism, the Great Replacement, identity politics, CRT, DEI, and on and on and on. We are awash in new vocabularies. But I think seeing liberal pluralism as a kind of neutral middle ground between opposed extremes is wrong for a variety of reasons, and perhaps we can get more into that in the conversation. But I want to focus on one of them today. The habit of defending pluralism in general as unmarked and apolitical, as a kind of casual, confident neutrality outside the realm of conviction, is very ill-suited to the new ideological politics that Tony identified. Berlin's pluralism in particular always had the feel of a kind of overstuffed Oxford sofa. You know, it was comfortable, it was cozy even, most enjoyable when it was occupied by two disagreeing friends. But that era is not ours. Berlin's era is not ours. Tony's era even is not ours. Liberal pluralists are, I think, confronted today with a clear set of counterclaims about history, about politics, economics, human nature, most powerfully from the extreme right, from MAGA Republicans to the Alternative for Germany, but not exclusively. And so pluralists of whatever stripe need a more robust account of what it is that they actually believe. We need a clearer idea of what pluralism is, what alternatives are on offer, how to energize, I believe, a specifically liberal pluralist worldview for our own time. And I want to spend the rest of the time I have available doing that. But first I want to describe briefly what this new era of ideological politics looks like, because most of us came of age at a time of triumph of a certain version of liberalism. So it takes some effort to reacquaint ourselves with what ideological politics looks like inside our own political systems in the U.S. as well as in Europe. And there are three things I would like to point to. First of all, I think we have to get used once again to competing vocabularies of politics. If there is a general consensus about the language in which politics is debated after the Second World War, words like freedom and human rights and European values as things that seem to flow across the political spectrum, vocabulary that everyone kind of agreed on, agreement about that is now absolutely gone. It's gone. The culturally defined nation is back. The family is back, along with words that we might have thought were banished forever, like purity, or vermin, or mass deportation, or blood. Those things are now part of our political discourse in a way that would have shocked Berlin, although perhaps not, because he had lived through that world. Might have shocked Tony, although he predicted that they might well return. These are, of course, the terms wielded by the extreme right, but liberals, I think, are unused even to debating mainstream conservatives, like really debating mainstream conservatives on politics and society in unfamiliar ways, where words like virtue and civilization might be part of the political discourse in a way that it's hard for liberals to get their head around. Those things have not been seriously debated, it seems to me, in our political discourse outside kind of college seminar rooms for a very long time. Secondly, ideas live in places. So we're going to have to get used again to the idea of competing centers of ideological politics. Russia, of course, has become one of those, one of the producers of ideas about government and greatness and gender that travel along the darker corridors of the internet. But thinkers and parties and institutions, philosophers, theorists in the United States, the EU, increasingly India, are part of that mix as well. It's even a toss-up, of course, an actual toss-up, and it's remarkable to contemplate this, whether in a matter of weeks, the ideas that animate the executive branches of government in the United States and Russia will come closer than ever before. You know, Andrei Sakharov used to talk in the 1960s about convergence, but that's not at all what Sakharov meant, I think, by convergence. Competing centers of ideas about politics. And third, we're going to have to think in terms not only of ideas and their purveyors, the places and people that produce them, but also the ecosystems that sustain them. And here I mean not just that miasma of social media and televised infotainment and professional influencers. You can go back to the 18th century. 18th century pamphleteering worked in very, very similar ways. Many of you will know that famous quote from David Hume about his treatise of human nature in 1739. It did fall dead born from the press. Even Hume was really worried about likes and followers in the 1730s. More troubling, though, is that our polarized, idea-driven politics operates inside a market today, in 2024, a market of churning consumerism. And this is most apparent in the United States, but it's not exclusive to the United States. So over the last 30 years, I think Americans have sorted themselves not so much into political parties or faith communities or racial and ethnic groups as into communities of consumption now. Private and religiously affiliated schools and universities, social media, cable, satellite television, communal entertainment, even clothing, home decor, are places of expressive ideology in ways that would have been astonishing just a few decades ago. So if you've not heard of Hillsdale College or watched a film produced by Angel Studios or purchased clothing from Cabela's or shopped for a scented candle at Altard State, you live on one side of a vast American divide, There's no exact European equivalent of this phenomenon right at the moment, which we might call kind of consuming your ideology until it becomes an identity. But the logic of ideological politics under consumerism has the potential to reshape it. Now, defending pluralism has always been a bit of a challenge because even people who look like anti-pluralists believe they're pluralists. So nationalists are perfectly willing to admit that other nationalities exist, just so long as they stay in their lane, and racists make the same rhetorical move, claiming that of course there are multiple races in the world. They should just stay in their racial station, as George Wallace used to put it in the 1960s. But the issue at stake, even for many contemporary conservatives who also see the world as plural, the issue at stake is what the default setting should be for the states that govern them. As Yoram Hazony has written about the United States, governments will have to, quote, restore Christianity as the normative framework and standard determining public life in every setting in which this aim can be attained, along with suitable carve-outs creating spheres of legitimate noncompliance. So that's a major thinker putting a set of ideas on the table that are not part of any kind of liberal consensus as we might have understood it after the middle of the 20th century. You can look to Josh Hawley. This is Josh Hawley at the 2024 National Conservatism Conference, as he put it, quote, not every citizen of America is a Christian, obviously, plural society, but every citizen is heir to the loves, to the liberties, to the common purpose our Christian tradition gives us. The same speech could, of course, have been given by any number of rightist politicians in the European Union, those isobars, again, crossing the Atlantic. So where does one go to explore the meaning of and a defense of liberal pluralism? In addition to this challenge that you're dealing often with anti-pluralists who think of themselves as pluralists, liberal pluralists will have to get better, I think, at making their case in a matrix of memory and history that's very different from that of the recent past. We're now in a moment when the signposts that have guided European and American thinkers, politicians since the mid-20th century are passing fully into history. The Second World War, Holocaust, Berlin Wall, 1968, 1989, these are, of course, no longer the experiences, the histories, the symbols they were for people of Berlin's generation or Tony's or, for that matter, mine. As societies change, the metaphors they have at their disposal, the vocabularies they use to talk about history also change. And it's a challenge in particular if liberal pluralists have attached their defense, to the degree they've given one, of liberal pluralism to those metaphors and symbols. Let me state this very, very plainly. I've been talking about the right up to now, but on the left, I don't think Western liberals are yet intellectually prepared for a reality in which the central world historical moral event of the 20th century may no longer be remembered as the Holocaust, but rather as decolonization. What does that world look like? What's a defense of liberal pluralism mean in that moment? W.E.B. Du Bois saw this already in 1925. How would Europe, and he was speaking here about Europe, not the United States, how would Europe reimagine itself if it became, quote, suddenly shadowless, in Du Bois's terms, that is, shorn of the overseas colonies against which European states had long defined themselves and their civilization? The challenge is that the right and the left already have worked out answers to that question. Certain versions of the right and the left already have answers worked out to that question. On the extreme right, it's simply good riddance to the shadows, which is the nationalist line. Good riddance. Of course, Europe should be shorn of those responsibilities and, by the way, shorn of the people who come from the places that used to be in the shadow of Europe. In fact, the far right in Europe has even started to redefine its view of the world as its own form of decolonization, its own future as a form of decolonization. As Björn Höcke, the Alternative for Germany leader in Thuringia, said in an interview not long ago, the EU must die for the true Europe to live. A renewed European nationalism is its own form of decolonization. On the multicultural left, of course, the response is equally clear. We are the shadows, many say. we're still here. We deserve visibility and a stake in European states. Meanwhile, I think liberal pluralists kind of chug along with a set of debates and a political vocabulary and existential worries that has been unchanged for far too long. So, what's the route out of this? I don't have time to go into all of them that there might be, and that's part of what our discussion is for, but let me just point to one. And that is that I think reviving a liberal pluralism, one way of doing it is to jump back to the 19th century, to a time when liberalism was not triumphant, but itself embattled. To recall a time when a liberal pluralism had to defend itself because it was not in power. With a kind of vitality in both Britain and in continental Europe that is as invigorating as it is unfamiliar. Sam Moyne has made this point in a recent book that we've forgotten the fact that before it was fearful, liberalism was genuinely liberating. That's why even if you go back to some of the great documents of the 19th century, even those dusty hymnals like On Liberty, which was published in 1859, you can feel the radical refreshing of your own brain as you read through these texts. So John Stuart Mill, of course, was writing in deep conversation with the purveyors of cognate and rival ideas. He understood the idea of rival ideas in the world. French liberals, continental socialists of various stripes, the Scottish writer, his great frenemy, Thomas Carlyle, who was in turn the great interpreter of German Romanticism and great defender of slavery, I might say, in the United States. But there was also Mill's wife, and I'm going to say a lot about Harriet Taylor. Also Mill's wife, who ought to receive at least equal billing for many of the ideas that Mill put forward in On Liberty and elsewhere. In fact, if you go to the top of On Liberty, it begins with an acknowledgement that Taylor was, quote, the inspirer and in part the author of all that's best in my writings. Were I but capable of interpreting to the world one half her great thoughts and noble feelings, I should be the medium of a greater benefit to it than is ever likely to arise from anything that I can write unprompted and assisted by all but unrivaled wisdom. By the way, that dedication is still not only one of the most romantic dedications of a husband to a wife in anything ever written, but there is nothing like it in the entirety of Western philosophy. Nothing like it. For Mill and Taylor, no one really knew what the best possible life might look like. No one knew. For that reason alone, individuals had to be given the freedom to figure out the best way to act and thrive. That's the source, of course, of their famous experiments of living phrase from On Liberty. Life should enable you, society should enable the maximum experiments of living. Because in a free society, that guaranteed at least that there was more of a chance. It didn't guarantee happiness so that you would come up with the best possible life, but it offered you the best possible chance that someone would come up with a formula, if not the formula, for what a good life might look like. As they put it, the only unfailing and permanent source of improvement is liberty, since by it there are as many possible independent centers of improvement as there are individuals. None of this came from tradition. None of this came from God. None of this even came from rights, although you could read a rights-based account of government, I suppose, back into what Mill and Taylor had to say. But rather, a liberal pluralist worldview it was a natural outgrowth of one of the few things in life we can be absolutely sure of, that we're going to meet other people. That's it. That we're going to meet other people with their own opinions, values, talents that are different from our own. All of the problems of morality come down essentially to this, the encounter with another human being who is different from myself. Now, as Rawls might have put it, now write a constitution. Now create a government that admits of that. The other key takeaway, I think, from rereading the classics, if you like, and Mill and Taylor in particular, is that they end up in a rather unusual place, not just with a denuded individualism, a denuded form of liberal pluralism, but with one that has obligation written into its very DNA. And that was because for Mill and Taylor, they saw their own marriage, their own household, which is a very unconventional one, as you may know, their own household as a kind of seminar, as in fact Mill would later put it in his autobiography, as a philosophical textbook for what it means to be individual, free, plural, different, and bound to someone else at the same time. How do you embody a kind of difference without otherness? For Mill and Taylor, they thought that the family was it. The family, as they put it in the autobiography, which, by the way, was also written with Taylor's input, a kind of philosophic textbook of a single truth, the importance to man and society of a large variety of types of character and of giving full freedom to human nature to expand itself in innumerable and conflicting directions. At their best, they thought families change us, which also turns out to be one of the foundations of plurality, democracy, social progress, encapsulating difference without otherness. If you can do that with one other person in the most intimate of settings, chances are you're going to be able to do that in society at large. In other words, it's possible to get to words like family and obligation and duty and virtue in these ways through a liberal pluralist lens, because in the 19th century, there were plenty of thinkers who thought that those things were not incompatible, but were in fact deeply intertwined. So I've spent a lot of time talking about Mill and Taylor here at because I think they can help us, help many liberal pluralists recast the ranking of things that ought to matter to them. Not just individualism, not just freedom, not just liberty, but this combination of other traits, family and duty and obligation, that Mill and Taylor thought were completely compatible with those. The thing that lies at the absolute heart of this, and that I think lies at the heart of our ideological politics today, and this is where I'll bring things to a close, the thing that lies at the absolute center that Mill and Taylor understood better than anyone in their time, regardless of debates about the size of government, the nature of the market, even the definition of the nation, the first thing that ought to matter to liberal pluralists is the equality of women and men. The need for an absolute equality of the sexes, Mill later said, was an abstract principle he had felt from childhood, but only through knowing and loving Taylor did it become a viscerally felt conviction. And yes, John Stuart Mill even talked about love. The linchpin, it was the linchpin, he said, of absolutely everything else. As he wrote in his autobiography, quote, "It's now the great question of the coming time, the most urgent interest of human progress, involving the removal of a barrier which now stops the way, renders all the improvements which can be effected while it remains slight and superficial." This is one of the founders of modern liberalism, who says that every other possible change in society, everything else that liberals might achieve, is slight and superficial without absolute equality of the sexes. And I bring that up here at the end because in our new era of ideological politics, in this new world that Tony foresaw almost 20 years ago, the glinting thread that connects the authoritarianism of Putin with the cultural revanchism of Orban, the Nazi-adjacent nostalgia of the Alternative for Germany with the manoverse of Trump as social media, that connects common good conservatism on the Catholic right with Christian nationalism of some Protestant evangelicals, is the question of equality between women and men. That's the thing that connects it. And until we start talking about that more, until liberal pluralists in particular start readmitting also more women writers to their own canon, which they're very good at criticizing others for, not so good at living, until that it becomes, again, as Mill and Taylor wanted it to be, the center of our own discussion, the center of our discussions about politics, about institutions, about what a good life might be. Until then, everything else, as Mill said, is slight and superficial. Thanks. I'll stop there. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks, Constanze.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this event which is very close to our heart, and which we have spent a long time of planning and preparing. I am really grateful to have you here. I'm grateful to have an extraordinary set of panelists here. But before I discuss your lecture with you, Tony, Charles, I would like to briefly pay homage to Tony, because I did know him. I was sort of a student of his in the extended sense, and because this is the inaugural Tony Judt Lecture and his family is watching, I would really like to do that. For those of you who don't know him and haven't read him, we have a bookstore outside, and we've stocked some of his books, which I warmly recommend to you, from Postwar to the Memory Chalet to Ill Fares the Land, and others. But for now, I will just say that Tony was a historian who was fluent in several languages, at home on both sides of the Atlantic, in Paris, in London, and in Prague. The Memory Chalet has a phenomenally funny and also insightful chapter about sex in Paris, London, and Prague. Do read it, it's hysterical. He was a citizen of the UK and the US. He did military service in Israel. He was proudly Jewish and pugnaciously skeptical and secular. He was an eloquent speaker, a graceful writer, passionate about ideas, a truly generous mentor and friend, and a devoted husband and father who showed us how to live even in the way he died. So I know that I am not the only one to have been mentored by him, and there are far more distinguished students of his, but like you, Tony changed my life, not least because he told me to write in English, which I do these days. Sometimes these sort of pushes have an extraordinary impact, and he had that on me. We're really delighted that Tony's wife and sons are letting us do this, and that the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future wants to support this project. And really, we could think of no one better than you, Charles, to give this inaugural lecture, given the enormous breadth of your topics. Again, lots of books by Charles out in our bookstore, and there's a new one coming out on Handel's Messiah. You've written on Istanbul, you've written on Moldova, you've written truly incisive pieces in foreign affairs on the philosophers of the New Right, and on Walt Rostow and neoliberalism. And we thought that really sort of makes you the perfect choice. And I find that there's really a lot to agree with in your offer of a more robust account of pluralism for the 21st century. The opposition to real equality as a through line, misogyny as another through line, the reminder about the shifting of historical frames. And I find you're situating your account of freedom in difference in successful, happy marriage very original and very charming and very appealing, particularly given the overt misogyny and the way that it is foregrounded in current debates. That has tremendous appeal. Where I begin to question, and honestly, I mean, I will say I think this has the makings of a book, right? I think this is the germination of a larger book, which I think you might want to discuss with your friends, and we would be always available for that. But where I begin to question, and where I think you sort of, your account might be not fully complete, is where you end your idea of healthy politics as a scaling up of peacefully negotiated difference. And I wonder whether that does enough to account for the fact that this current return of ideology is also very much, and perhaps even more than articulate ideology. And not least because I think much of the ideological writing appears to me to be so poor, to be so desiccated, to be so graceless, right? Both in how it is written and in the ideas that it propounds. How does your account deal with the return of contestation, conflict, zero-sum thinking in domestic politics, but also in international politics, and finally, the very clear return of cruelty, right? Which is what Julius Klarer, whom I also had the great good fortune to be taught by, was so concerned by. It does seem to me right? That the attempts to reintroduce cruelty as an acceptable form of behavior in our domestic societies, in our politics, and in international relations, whether it is people marching with tiki torches, and whether it is invading a peaceable country, right, is a central characteristic of the modern age. And so let me ask you this, and then I'll give you a chance to answer. Is not the liberalism of the 20th century, rooted as it was in the experience of war, destruction, and evil, premised on the assumption that now everything will be better, that there will be endless growth, that there will be stability and endless peace, and therefore there will not be contestation for access, and there will not be zero-sum fights for public goods, right? And it seems to me that much of this cruelty, the reason why the cruelty has so much appeal for people, why so many people are allowing themselves to participate in cruelty, either rhetorical or physical, is fear of a return, of having to fight for access, for having to fight for rights, and the assumption that they will have to fight other human beings for it.
Well, thank you, Constanze. I mean, these are the huge issues, and I hope we get into some of them with the panel as well, because I'd love to hear what our colleagues say too. Let me just make two sort of broad points in response. First of all, I mean, I think what strikes one, particularly on the right, and in a pre-seminar we did about this lecture here at Brookings, we had discussed whether the threat to liberal pluralism is symmetrical or asymmetrical. You know, is it really coming mainly from the extreme right as opposed to the progressive left? And Frank Fukuyama makes that point in his book from, I guess, 2 years ago on the crisis of liberalism, where he says, you know, look, on the progressive left, the threat is really kind of cultural, if you like, and institutional, maybe in universities or cultural institutions. But on the far right, this is a mobilized political force. And therefore, as he sees it, far more dangerous. But as you read the philosophers, thinkers, and I'll put the politicians to one sort of side because I don't think one has to engage them kind of at the ideas level, but the philosophers and thinkers on the right today, so many of the ideas, to me, are based not just on morally questionable premises, but terrible history and awful social science. And I think that is a sort of a place to begin, that the factual claims, you know, in defense of Christian nationalism, in defense of the timelessness of the nation, for example.
Or of invading other countries.
Or invading, for that matter, invading other countries, and doing it in terms of the restoration of some kind of ancient cultural tie. These things are simply factually wrong, right? And the more one can make the case, the sort of factual case first, or lead with the factual, the fact of the matter, I think that's still a powerful line. In the written version of this, I do have some things, as you know, about Judah Sklar and cruelty, and that'll, I assume, be up on the website at some point. I didn't have time to get into today in detail, but the second point is that I think liberal pluralists have to refresh their own vocabulary of politics, because freedom has been overtaken by everyone. You know, pluralism is a view that even nationalists can get on board with. It's just a different version of pluralism. But there is within the liberal tradition all sorts of other quite arresting ways of talking about politics that change the vocabulary of things that liberal pluralists think that they're defending. Visibility. Who is visible to the state? Who is seen by the state? Who does the state care about? And whose rights does the state seek to defend? What is our theory of nature and of human nature, and our claims to naturalness that politicians or thinkers might make? Are those legit or not? And then, as you say, cruelty. You know, Sklar has that famous essay, Putting Cruelty First. What would it do to our politics if we put at the very top of our list of vicious things being cruel? And would that change the way in which liberals defend their own kind of turf?
Okay.
Just on that final sentence on that point, let's not, however, see this as a problem of politics in general. It's men, it's boys. This is the world that cruelty comes from. It comes from a gendered, to use my critical theory colleagues' words, a gendered space, and we can't ignore that.
Charles, much as I really like your uxoriousness, I will point out that at least in my country, there are prominent women on the hard right whose language and thinking is at least as cruel as that of the men's. And as we know, there are women guarding the concentration camps who were equally cruel. So I don't think I can claim for my gender, right, that we are in this key sense exceptional. I do want to get back to the point, though, of why the cruelty is so appealing. And I want to ask you, again, doesn't your account of liberalism still assume the existence of the possibility of a social contract under conditions where there is, at least in some quarters of our societies, a sense that the walls are closing in, that there will be competition for livelihoods, that governments are losing control over the equal distribution or the creation of public goods, and that, in other words, there is a reversion to homo homini lupus, right? Wolves against wolves, because there is a sense that the Enlightenment version of the social contract that is accessible and available to all, not just to men and women, right, but to all creeds, to all races, right, to all people on the basis of human dignity, that is no longer feasible, and that therefore we need to question human dignity. I mean, that is what cruelty does, right? That's what, to me, is so shocking about this moment. And lest people wonder why we here at Brookings are discussing this, because we tend to be on this stage discussing policy and politics, it seems to me that precisely because of the return of ideology, right, and the return of cruelty, we need to understand and discuss the foundational currents of our time and how they impact the way, and I hate the use of impact as a verb, now I've done it. Damn. Loss of self-control. Yeah. Anyway, but you take...
Cruelty is only possible, so cruelty is only possible in conditions in which recognition becomes impossible, right? And recognition becomes impossible when you practice your own failure to recognize the dignity, humanity, essential equality of the person that you're encountering. And I have to believe that I think this is a problem of politics and institutions, perhaps of the market in some ways. It's not, I think, an issue. It's not a problem that is sort of fundamental to the way in which humans behave with each other. Here we may get into, realms of religion and what do we believe in, theories of human nature, I suppose. But it has. We're in this moment where a certain kind of cruel behavior sells, and I do believe that has a gendered component to it. And I don't mean that it's only men who are capable, biological men, if you like, who are capable of this. It's just that those qualities are now, in the market in which we live, classed as male qualities. Right?
No, absolutely, and I think on that we agree, right?
In other words, you and my wife and I, Maggie Paxton, talk about this all the time in our sort of morning breakfast seminars. It's wonderful to be married to an anthropologist. But you've got to practice. You've got to practice stuff, and it's as easy to practice anti-cruelty as it is to practice cruelty, but we're in this moment where I think so many of the arrows in the world in which we live, from social media to how politicians behave to the consumer society in which we live, point toward a kind of cruel behavior. And the thrill of that kind of cruelty that's become very, very powerful as a marketing force.
Clearly, and I think the point here is that the transgressiveness of that thrill, right, is the reason why it is so appealing to so many, in so many different varieties. But let me ask you something else, though. I mean, your model of marriage is one that ultimately is negotiated, is, I assume, peaceable, is, I assume, one in which coercion has no place. Modern societies can't live on that model alone. It is an aspect of modern societies. It is a very demanding aspect for many people. And I think we all know that there is an element of power, hierarchy, and coercion necessary to make modern societies and modern states function, right? One characteristic of the modern state is that it has the police power, and in fact, it has the police power in order to prevent cruelty, right? And so what I think that your model is missing, and what I think a book might explore, is how this more robust account of pluralism coexists with a state reimagined for the stresses, right, and the disruptions of the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, look, Mill and Taylor, for example, were not giving us an account. They didn't believe that you would get an answer to what tax rates should be from inside a marriage, right? And of course, On Liberty is not really about sort of constitution, it's not at all about constitutional design. It's about how society itself should function. But I think they were trying to go to first principles, like, what are the things how should society be structured so that you can get to answers, you can get to some kind of common answer about what you think a constitution ought to look like or tax rates should be. But you're certainly not going to read it off of, they certainly didn't believe that you're going to read it off of an individual relationship between men and women, say.
Well, that is what our panel is for. So what I'm going to do is ask our panelists to come on the stage. You and I are going to move over here, and you can come up here and join us. Oops. Maria over there, and then EJ in the middle. All right, wonderful. So in the next hour, we are going to continue to explore the lecture by Charles and the sort of germination of critique that we've just undertaken with a truly fabulous and very diverse panel. I will introduce you in the order of addressing you. And just to be perfectly clear, I've told the panelists I see myself as in the role of an air traffic controller here. You can and should respond to Charles's points. You should, if you want to have a two-finger question, just wave at me. Please don't throw anything. But let me start with EJ. EJ is the W. Averill Harriman Chair and Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at Brookings. He's a syndicated columnist. He's written innumerable books and teaches at Georgetown. And the health of the American polity has really been your lifelong concern. Founded, I think, in Catholicism, at least personally. And I was wondering if you could maybe start out by responding to Charles's lecture. How does Charles's appeal for a more robust liberalism square with your own lived experience of American politics that you've been watching for so long, and the challenges of the day?
I should begin by saying this is a case of the last shall be first, because I think my colleagues here, I cannot wait to hear from them. I also want to say what a profound honor it is to do this, because I have been deeply, deeply influenced in my life. I wish I had known Tony Judt, but his work has been really formative to me, both his historical work, and I agree, and I'm going to get there, to his fundamental conclusion that social democracy is a kind of path to the decency we're seeking. And I want to get there. A second thing I want to say is, you should write that book that Constanze said, not only because I wanted about 10 sentences for every one I read, but I want you to challenge John Stuart Mill in the love and respect and appreciation for your wife, whom I've had the pleasure to meet today. It would be a wonderful passage. I also want to honor my friend and colleague Bill Galston in the audience, whom I'm going to channel in a moment, who knows far more about Isaiah Berlin than I do and is deeply devoted to his thinking. And I hope Bill joins the conversation today. I want to begin by saying what the sentence I most appreciated in your paper was about the importance of equality in understanding what pluralism needs to be. Because when you describe some of the far-right groups as being fundamentally pluralist, I think they actually miss the fundamental, and this goes to Constanze's point about cruelty, the fundamental that it is not really pluralism if you don't accept the equal dignity of every person. It may be something that's plural, it may recognize plural societies, but I don't think that meets the definition of liberal pluralism that you suggest. Secondly, Bill can speak for himself, but I have struggled with Isaiah Berlin's work. I realized I'm the only person wearing a tie, so I believe I belong on that comfortable sofa you described back in the 1950s. But Bill makes the point, and I'd love you to talk about that Isaiah Berlin can't be seen as an end of ideology guy, in a way that I think your argument kind of conflates Berlin with the end of ideology thinking of the later on in the 1950s, when in fact Berlin's thought arose out of a conflict, a conflictual period, and I'd love you to respond to that. And the part of Berlin I most appreciated is the part of Berlin that saw politics, democratic politics, but all kinds of politics, as involving agonistic choices, that the hardest choices are not between good and evil, but between and among competing goods. And I think that Berlin teaches us every day, if we kind of consider that in analyzing what kind of choice am I making here? Is it between good and evil, or bad and good, or are we really talking about competing goods? And that is the value of pluralism. Where I think Tony Judt, and I heard him in your talk here, particularly in your talk about equality, where I have been uncomfortable with Berlin's formulations is I read his distinction, freedom from, freedom to distinction as too negative to freedom to. I think he is too willing to, and he's obviously influenced by Nazism and the rise of Stalinism in particular, but he is too willing to downgrade freedom to freedom freedom from. I'm sorry, and argue against the importance of the possibility of government and society empowering people and expanding their freedom. And that's, I think, where Tony Judt comes in, and his interest in social democracy comes in. I am very struck that in his new book, which I have not read yet, but have heard him talk about, Timothy Snyder's new book on freedom, where I think that his book reflects his long engagement. I mean, his Thinking the 20th Century, which is based on interviews with Tony Judt, he clearly is channeling him, I think, in this new book. And he lays very, very much stress on the empowering possibilities of freedom to, that freedom from is inadequate. And I think this goes to two other points I want to make. One, when you in his introduction to the 20th Century book, he says that Judt turned to social democracy for many reasons, but one of the primary one is he believes it is the path to a decent society, which goes to your anti-cruelty society. And I think when we're looking at the world we're in now, there is a great debate kind of among sociologists, political scientists of what explains the rise of this new extreme right. And the simplistic or simple way to put it is this primarily about immigration and the changes in European societies and immigration here in the United States, or is it primarily the result of vast economic changes? Now, I think it's impossible to play down the role of immigration. And it's clear, even with the rise of the AfD, it comes from the opening of, I think, the real spark came from Angela Merkel's, I thought, brave opening of Germany to over 1 million migrants. And we can't deny that. But the backlash on immigration is in the context of economic change that has hollowed out large parts of Europe and the United States. And that's where I think the corrective that Judd is talking about is important. So what I'd like you to do is, I'd love you to answer Bill's sort of thoughts about, is it fair to Berlin to situate him as primarily an end of ideology theorist, or is there more going on there? But secondly, to talk about the role of economics, I just want to close my intellectual heart is with Michael Walzer. And I love Michael Walzer's new book, The Struggle for a Decent Politics, because he points us to the idea that perhaps we should think of liberalism less as a philosophy than as an adjective. And if I can just close with Walzer, like all adjective, liberal modifies and complicates the nouns it precedes. It has the effect that it is sometimes constraining, sometimes enlivening, sometimes transforming. It determines not who we are, but how we are who we are, how we enact our ideological commitments. And I think that Walzer gives us a path between Tony and Isaiah Berlin, I think, in this way of thinking about a kind of a new form of intellectual pluralism. And thank you.
All right, now I find myself provoked as well, but I'm going to let Charles. No, I don't think we should do that, because otherwise I at least will be completely confused.
Okay.
But that's perhaps possible for one or two other people in the audience.
Right.
So I will in fact ask you to engage with every one of the panelists, because this is basically this is a PhD murder board.
Oh yeah, it feels like it. It feels like it. Exactly.
So let's start with
one where you're told in advance you've got the degree, and now we want to talk to you. You know.
That's right. That's right. So I'm not going to be able to, I think, address everything that EJ raised, but let me take a few of them. First of all, I agree. I don't think I'm arguing that Berlin is an end of ideas, end of ideology kind of person. I mean, he was counterposed to the idea of certainty, of ideas that themselves proclaimed the end of conflict or the end of history. And of course, he thought of himself as occupying a position where you were making decisions in the world about things that were genuinely different beliefs, deeply held different beliefs, and that's the best you could sort of do. That you had to live in that space where uncertainty, skepticism, whatever rule. But I think we're in a different kind of place at the moment. I don't see our choices right now as being agonistic over different kinds of good. I think we're in the moment now where we have on offer fundamentally different views about human nature, about not just about sort of policy, but about history and about what constitutes the nation. Right? How do we define the nation in a way that we haven't seen certainly since 1989 or 1991, but even in a major mobilized political way we haven't seen in Europe since the end of the Second World War. So the ideological space I think that we inhabit is very different from the one that Berlin inhabited, and therefore he was of course responding to a different, he was responding to the world as he found it. Positive negative liberty, which of course is I think a very suggestive framework, the liberty from something or the liberty to something. The difficulty I have is always applying the positive liberty side of things. A colleague who knows much more about Berlin than I do said that in going through Berlin's notes, he found Berlin having listed 6 or 7 forms of liberty and then got it down to, writers do this all the time. You've got to have a simpler frame and sort of squeeze them into 2. I don't think the positive liberty idea gives us enough of a roadmap without a lot of real work. Do we mean something philosophical by it, that the conditions under which one can realize autonomy or self-determination, or do we really mean something as practical as universal health care?
But aren't those two the same?
Well, not necessarily, because you could have a huge debate about, so you can have a Kantian idea that, freedom, like liberty really is about the freedom to choose the good things, right? And in fact, people on the right, on the political right, make exactly this argument. The left doesn't have a theory of beauty anymore. The left doesn't have a theory of what the good actually is. And so Hillsdale College is going to instruct you in what all of those things are so that you are genuinely, truly free to choose the good things. So I don't think I really don't think Berlin is going to help us much here, and I haven't read Tim's book yet either, and I'm kind of curious to see how he squares the circle. On the final point about cruelty, I think Hannah Arendt may be able to help us a little bit here, and it would have been interesting to see sort of how she and Schar would have sort of responded to this particular point. Because I've found in the last few years that if I'm trying to make predictions about what the extreme right does, a policy position they might take or something that a political leader might say, I'm much better to think not in terms of what is the cruelest thing I can imagine, but what's the most notorious thing I can imagine. And Arendt has this wonderful line in which she's really worried about a politics of the future. In fact, she saw it in her day, of what she called Madison Avenue methods taking over politics, in which, of course, truth disappeared, and all you were interested in was sort of keeping your viewers or readers' attention. And in a world of social media, that becomes all the more important, right? It's the thrill, you said the transgressive thrill. That we're in this moment where it's the notoriety has replaced, I think, authenticity or truth as the measure of political power in a way. And you can derive cruelty as one of the things that's consequential to that.
Could I ask one quick question, then I'll cede which is whether the idea of agonistic choices is helpful in the current circumstance. As a political matter, I obviously agree with you on the importance of rejecting the extreme right and the notion that I am a liberal pluralist in your terms. But if you think about where these impulses come from, I often think about political thought in one's own head as a war among the priority of liberty, equality, and fraternity or community. And if you want to understand where some of the far-right sentiment comes from, it comes from a sense that liberalism has desiccated community in the society. And so to understand an answer to the far right, to understand what kind of argument can you make to someone who is tempted by the far right's kind of nationalist form of communitarianism, you have to understand that there is a competing good in the minds of many who support this set of ideas. I just wanted to throw that at you and ask how you respond.
And that's the generous version, right, of that.
It is.
I will say, and I'll just leave that standing a bit because I want to get to Oren. It seems to me that the question of sort of messing with people's concepts of truth and authenticity, the search for notoriety, strikes me as a second-order problem compared to the resurgence of legitimation of cruelty. Right? That to me is the fundamental violation, the shocking violation of our belief in the sanctity of human dignity.
I couldn't agree more. I'm talking about how do you defeat it.
But now I'm going to Oren because this is where the air traffic controller comes in. Jesus. Oren, thank you for joining us. It's, I think, your first time here at
I think
on the
it
Brookings
is, yeah.
stage. Yeah, and it's great to have you. You're the founder and chief economist of the conservative think tank American Compass, which I read was interesting, which was fascinating to read, is attempts to establish a post-Trump right-of-center body of thinking. Let's see how that goes. You're contributing editor at the Financial Times, good thing. Author of The Once and Future Worker. So we might discuss whether that is social democratic, or your thinking on centering work over consumption and the worker over consumers is actually social democratic in its roots. And I first encountered you in public with when I listened to your very crisp critique of the National Conference, the National Conservatism Conference, as a plenary speaker at the National Conservatism Conference. In fact, at the end, I was rather taken with that. And I've also just read your really fascinating new essay, Constructing Conservatism, in the October issue of First Things. And so I wanted to ask you, obviously, to respond to what you've heard and from Charles, and I suspect you might have views. But I also wanted to cite a sentence that you have in that essay where you critique the MAGA right for the thrill of transgression. That's where I had that using or centering, focusing on the thrill of transgression, but not a workable vision for governance, right? You focus on the role of duty, obligation, and solidarity in your writing. And I was hoping that you might give us a counterpoint to Charles's theory of a more robust liberalism that is built around these ideas. Over to you. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a great privilege to be here. And Charles, thank you for the remarks. They were incredibly thought-provoking. I'm delighted to pick up right where you were just leaving off on the question of sort of cruelty versus the community concerns. Because I think to put those concerns as second order behind the cruelty is exactly backward, and it speaks to what would be my main concern with Charles's diagnosis and how he proceeds, which is that I don't hear any theory of how we got here. If I follow this narrative, it seems like we had this sort of liberal consensus. Maybe people got self-satisfied. We reached the end of history, and then, whoa, Donald Trump, right? The people who elected Donald Trump had elected Barack Obama by large majorities 4 and 8 years earlier. They're the same voters, although in fact they are slightly younger and more of the new generation. And so it seems to me we need to grapple a lot more seriously, both in substantive terms and conceptual terms, with where this has come from, because it does not just spring forth out of somebody's forehead. In substantive terms, I think EJ did a good job highlighting sort of immigration as certainly one issue in both economic and cultural terms, broader economic change. To Charles's point about the importance of facts, let's just spend a moment on what's actually happened during this moment, this era of liberal triumph. And particularly let's focus on men and boys, because I have to say it rang very hollow for me, the idea that sort of lifting up women's equality is a remedy to what we face right now. A young man today does not earn more, inflation adjusted, than he did in 1969. A young man today has far less than a 1 in 5 chance of actually completing high school, going on to college, completing college, and getting a job that requires a college degree. And yet that is essentially all we offer. We have converted our entire education system to that model, and one that is producing far better outcomes for women than for men. And then we see, to EJ's point about community, the widespread decline, if not outright collapse, in family formation at the outset, to Charles's point of emphasis, and more broadly, community health in broad swaths of the country, frankly, outside the enclaves where liberalism has been so triumphant and self-satisfied. And so I don't know how we can actually engage a discussion of how to reclaim that liberal center without having an honest list of, say, 5 things that liberalism got completely wrong and needs to atone for and reform. And I certainly don't think we can look to those who are proposing to go a different direction and lecture them without an acknowledgement and answer to those questions. The second point, which is the more conceptual one, is this description of sort of how we've come to our current political moment actually reminded me a lot of, there was a chart in the New York Times recently that got well-deserved guff. It was about the widening gap on views toward immigration. And it showed, over the last 30 years, Republican and Democrat points of view. And what showed us that Republican views haven't actually changed very much at all. Democrat views have shot off in a very different direction. And then they added these little illustrative trend lines that showed, excuse me, the blue line kind of straight and the red line plunging away with no correlation whatsoever to the actual data. And if you actually step back and ask what has changed since the 1950s, 1960s liberal settlement, honestly, I think what Josh Hawley is saying today would sound an awful lot more familiar to Eisenhower or JFK, for that matter, than what Kamala Harris is saying, or for that matter, what Charles is saying. And so that's not necessarily an indictment of where liberalism has headed. We should expect social and political change over time, but we need to acknowledge that where we are now trying to assert this common sense liberal center has journeyed a great distance from the actual settlement that worked for the majority of the American people. It seems to me the burden is on those making the case for that to acknowledge the distance and justify it, not to say we don't understand, we're just standing here on this moving walkway.
But can I just stop you there for a second and ask you, it seems to me that what is actually happening in liberalism is a fairly energetic self-critique. Usually the term employed as neoliberalism is dead, right? There is an acknowledgement that the form of liberalism that is actually both situated, that you can find both on the left and in sort of Reaganist conservatism, which is, let the state stay out of this, markets and society can take care of all of it, right? I think there is a broad acknowledgement now that phase really is consigned to history, right? And that's the part of the liberal self-critique. It's not as though that critique is not being made. I think the problem seems to me rather, right, that is the difficulty of going, in other words, is not of analyzing what went wrong, right, which is a lot of things which we can quantify and describe, but the difficulty of actually steering around and finding a common consensus on what to do about it in order to recreate a social contract. Is that fair?
I agree that conversation is going on in our politics. I don't see it going on to the extent I would like it to on this stage. And I think it's also very important to ask, okay, what is it that liberalism got wrong that led to those mistakes? And so what are we going to do differently? Because it seems to me the natural extension of Charles's argument would in fact be to repeat that exact set of mistakes again. So that's the question I would pose to Charles is, okay, what did we get wrong and what are we going to do differently? And I just want to make one final point very quickly about the cruelty rhetoric, which I have to say I find quite counterproductive. I think there's no question there's a problem with cruelty in our politics today. But I think it's very important to step back and think about how different groups in our society would interpret the types of cruelty that we've been encountering in recent decades. And for most people, the person who goes to an Ivy League school, gets an MBA, goes to work for a private equity firm, earns millions of dollars per year, buys out a company with a bunch of debt from one of his friends' private equity firms, and shuts down the factory and moves the production to China, is behaving far more cruelly than the politician who gets up on stage and says mean things. And a nation whose politicians do not acknowledge and do anything about that is going to turn to politicians who will, regardless of how they talk. And so I think it's fine to critique cruel rhetoric, but I don't think we can do that disconnected from a much deeper soul searching about what has actually happened to people in this country that is creating the conditions for it.
Look, I think that is perfectly, I don't think anybody on this panel, including me, would contradict you on that. The point where I would push back, right, is that we're not just seeing cruelty of rhetoric, we're also seeing cruelty of action, right? And that one can lead to the other, and that therefore there is a responsibility of the speaker, right, when that speech engenders actions. But I'm going to step back again and...
Well, just maybe very quickly in response. I mean, I think these are all very well taken points, Warren, and you've been incredibly eloquent in trying to get conservatives to understand that there, but conservatives and liberals, I think, to understanding that there are, that we need to have a new political economy on offer as well. And you've been, I think, one of the most important voices for arguing that. I do think that the claims about structural changes in the economy and the need for structural change in the economy, the need for the return, I mean, Kamala Harris, we're not getting into details of U.S. politics here, but when she speaks of an opportunity economy, I think she has in mind exactly some of the things that you're arguing. And it strikes me that it's going to be easier to do that from a liberal position than it is from a conservative position, even though Patrick Deneen has tried kind of valiantly to argue that a kind of economic populism plus a rightist cultural politics is where the majority of Americans are. And I'm not sure I agree with that. On the cruelty point, here I think is the distinction that I understand the point about structural cruelty and the long-term effects of that, and I agree with you. But there are policy solutions to the kinds of things that you've just laid out. Opportunity, inequality, the long-term hollowing out of globalization, and so on. Those have policy solutions to them. The cruelty of what a politician says does not. And it's a demeaning, undignified, and ultimately incredibly dangerous form of normalizing a way of talking about other people that I think can't be solved on Capitol Hill, whereas these things I think do admit of policy solutions that, again, I think are more likely to come from liberals than from conservatives. Final point is that for all of the argument about the economic effects or the economic causes of the conditions in which we find ourselves, I think there are two facts that push in the opposite direction. First is the pure thin accident of the political events that led to where we are now. Had 70,000 voters across 3 states voted differently, we would be having a very different diagnosis of our current condition. That's sort of point. Had Brexit gone slightly differently, we would have had a different argument about the success of the right there. But the second point is that the rise of this kind of rightist politics takes place in very different political economies. Right. So it takes place in welfare states in Europe, just as it takes place in neoliberal sort of systems in the United States. And so there's something else going on besides the pure political economic story here, even though I very much agree with you that that has to be part of the conversation.
But then let me, if I may, come back at this question of the role of government and the state. In a period that you were quoting this passage in Tony Judt's lecture here at Brookings, in an age of insecurity where borders are becoming porous and where governments are and markets, where governments are losing control and markets are borderless and everything, people, ideas, goods, data move without us being able to exercise power over much of them. How do you, Oren, conceptualize a conservative version of a state that resolves those problems without going to the extremes that it seems to me the constitutional revisionists of the national conservatism movement, right, are trying to aim for? Because in the end, what I think you're describing, without having read your book on work, it sounds more like a social democratic model, and that has had its own flaws and weaknesses that we're seeing now in Europe.
Well, I guess I don't understand the framing that the people and goods are somehow moving uncontrollably. They will move exactly as controllably or uncontrollably as we choose to control them. And in fact, it seems to me actually recognizing and enforcing a border is an absolute precondition to the kind of social democracy. And I would disagree with Charles that the political economy in Europe is different. I think the exact same set of migratory, globalization, deindustrialization pressures are driving the same phenomena, whether you are talking about a large welfare state or the U.S. model. And so that is the question I would essentially throw back. Are we going to enforce our border or not? Because if we're not going to, then it seems to me the rest of this is almost sort of just inside the Beltway chatter, and we are going to see our politics continue going in exactly the direction it is. And if we are, then I think that's very encouraging, but we need to know how we're going to reconcile it with this concept of liberalism that has thrown that out the window.
All right. Well, I don't want to sort of be the one who sort of monopolizes the conversation here, and I do want to hear from Maria. We'll just leave that conversation hanging or that question hanging, come back to it.
I will actually continue that conversation.
Good, wonderful. Maria Snegovaya is a senior fellow for Russia and Eurasia at the Center for Strategy and International Security, our neighbors in close a walking distance from here. She's a postdoc fellow at Georgetown's Walsh School of Foreign Service. And importantly, you've just published what I believe is the book version of your PhD thesis, When Left Moves Right, about the shifts in the party political landscape in Eastern Europe, which I think your argument is are strikingly similar to what is happening in Western democracies. And I would like you to talk about that. But before you do, I just wanted to mention, because you were born in St. Petersburg and now live here, that 3 days ago, on the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Eastern Poland, the Russian Foreign Ministry posted on X, on social media, that the Stalin had to do this to prevent genocides in Belarus and in Poland. Again, a striking and frankly, I mean, both absurd and terrifying illustration of the phenomenon that you were talking about earlier, right? Of the turning upside down of authenticated historical truths. But that's just an observation. I know that you are struggling with that kind of thing, as we all are. But do tell us about your book research and about the how the movement, or I think your key thesis is that the movement to the center of the left parties, right, which we're seeing in decay all over Europe and being replaced by very odd new formations, especially in my country, has actually helped give oxygen to the more extreme versions of the right.
Thank you very much, Constanze. I'm really honored to be here at this esteemed panel. And what strikes me as very ironic about this conversation, and also sad, is that very much the warnings that Berlin made in his essay about us, stopping uncertainty, preventing this deliberation and being convinced in dogmas, unfortunately, I think is what explains partly the troubles that liberalism has faced. Because honestly, from where I come from, and here I have to agree with the previous speaker, the issues with the liberalism today is because liberalism has become a victim of its own success. After the end of communism, the triumphalist narratives, the end of history, indeed tended to present as the liberal democratic ideas as not having any alternative. Subsequently, we've seen that, unfortunately, they don't always lead to where we hope they would. And indeed, as I show in post-communist Europe, despite all the regional idiosyncrasy that I always want to flag for my fellow post-communist Eastern European, Central European colleagues, we don't deny. Nonetheless, the trends and parallels in this process are very, very much alike. That too much neoliberalism, not recognizing the social context, pushing forward what has become known as this Brussels agenda, without recognition of the local idiosyncrasy of the fact that not all of the societies are always willing and able to instantly accept and embrace those ideas, unfortunately is going to lead to the backlash when those ideas do not deliver. In much of that same dynamic trajectory that we currently see in Hungary, in Russia, maybe like to less extent now in Poland, elsewhere, is honestly the result of these triumphalist narratives of liberalism. And I have to say that I'm saying that as myself being the product of liberalism. My advisor back in Russia was Evgeny Yasin, one of the major Russian reformers. But one thing that was not recognized at the time is that, for example, losers of modernization have to be compensated. You can't just throw them into the water and ask them to swim. If you don't do that, then in this electoral round number 2 or 3, they will reconsolidate and vote for somebody who offers them an alternative. Often, unfortunately, the alternative actually presumes going back to the past. And that's my major kind of point that I want to add. It's true that liberalism has created issues, right? There's economic orthodoxy has led to the rebellion of the so-called economical globalization losers, and the term itself is very telling. These are the groups who do not find that themselves, they all will be improved. And I encourage you, if you wonder what is the problem with liberalism is, to travel to those provinces, for example, in Hungary, where former industries have been closed, and you see people not having any permanent jobs, like the environment is very unpleasant, there's high rates of crimes and whatnot. It's very understandable that this environment would lead to polarization. That's partly the product of the reforms that led to closing off on inefficient factories and industries, but unfortunately those groups have not been compensated. The same comes to the social cultural dimension, which is less of a issue in my book, but obviously the Brussels inviting newcomers to embrace the ideals of progressivism in the more traditional societies which were not necessarily instantly prepared to it will lead to backlash. And we've seen that, for example, in Poland, where a deeply religious society, where an effort to push forward this agenda led to backlash. The good news, somewhat, if you may, like if you're into that sort of good news, is that alternative movements don't necessarily, at least in my opinion, and based on my analysis, have a very clear option, alternative offering to liberalism. Democracy is now the only game in town. We do not see, for example, democracy being denied by any of the movements, Fidesz, Law and Justice, you name them. They will always claim that they're the true Democrats, right? They will claim the opposite side is not democratic enough. Markets, we actually studied that in a lot of detail with Mitchell Orenstein. Is there really an alternative political economy of populism? We don't think it is. Yes, there is more, a little bit more for distribution offer, targeted usually to social constituencies that vote for these groups. There is more of kind of deglobalization in forms of tariffs, that, by the way, has been introduced by Trump administration, and the Biden administration continued that same policy, which is less often talked about. But there is no real alternative to open markets. Lastly, pluralism. That's what Charles pointed out in his talks. Same story. There is no real alternative to pluralism, even if both sides sort of debate what it is and who should be offered the platform. So it is true that we are finding ourselves in the moment of crisis of liberalism, which is directly a product of the previous triumph of liberalism. But really, there is no true alternative to that. And hence, these movements, and this is where, Constanze, I wanted to link to your point about that tweet by the Russian MFA, they don't really have an option other than going back to the way things were. The good old days, like let's make Russia great again or America great again or you name it. But really it's just going back to the same ideas which already lost really in that battle. So to me, this feels like a moment of where we know what the problems are, we don't know what the answers are. But the solution to that, unlike Charles, I do not think is doubling down on more of the same, including impatience to stupidity and outrage of injustice, to cite your presentation. But honestly, I think to really embrace liberal and pluralist ideas and to become a little bit more open to at least the criticism that is being offered, and hopefully we will eventually find some common ground there.
Right. I think Charles needs the first right response. AJ, I see you twitching. I mean, all of you can twitch, but I think Charles goes first.
No, I'm engaged. I'm not twitching. That was a great presentation. Thank you.
I should just very quickly. Thank you, Maria. That was. I'm certainly not arguing for doubling down and doing more of the same. On the contrary, I think liberals need an entirely new vocabulary for defending their own position. I think they have to be in a position of trying to defend their position rather than assuming it in a kind of end of history way. And I think it has to be renewed. And here I agree with Oren. I mean, I think there has to be much more attention to the things that haven't worked and things that need reform. But I see that happening kind of all around us. I don't, at least on the economic side. I don't think, oddly enough, it's happening as much on the philosophical or theoretical side as it might elsewhere. Particularly these, Maria's raised this and Oren raised it as well, particularly the focus on individuals that, who were not at all beneficiaries of the liberalism that was the particular form of liberalism that was touted so much over the last 30 years. But if I could, I wanted to throw a question back to Oren for more sort of elaboration, which is the kind of boy trouble question, sort of, we might call it.
By the way, our colleague Richard Reeves wrote an entire book, right?
Yeah.
And certainly, I don't think anybody here, I assume, is going to disagree with the fact with you on that point, right?
I want to disagree. I want to disagree. So I want to disagree. So I want to disagree in the sense that. While it is true that, at least in the United States, if you look at, you're trying to define the core right and far right constituency, sort of Gen X white college educated men, high school educated men are going to be a key component of that. But the other statistic that strikes me as really important is the massive gap between, say, 18 and 26-year-olds on Trump v. Harris, where you see this incredible divergence between young men and young women across the political right and the political left. And I don't think 18 to 26-year-olds have quite the same experience as Gen X individuals of globalization and jobs disappearing and the hollowing out of portions of the U.S. economy. So I think something else is going on besides just a response to economic hardship. And I would love to hear what you had to say about whether you think the plight of the boy trouble problem, the plight of young men, is really as central, as economically driven as I thought you were indicating.
I think it's a good point that younger men are sort of facing a different experience in some respects. But that's why I focused on the education piece in particular. I think a key element of the broader liberal project has been a transformation of our education system in a way that just empirically has served young men quite poorly, overwhelmingly, in the outcomes that they're experiencing. And so if you're asking what the life experience of an 18 to 26-year-old man has been, for upwards of 80% of them, it has been falling off the high school to college career track that is held up as deep ticket to the middle class and success, and in being offered literally nothing instead. I mean, I'm not opposed to supporting people who want to and can succeed in college, going to college. That's great. I am opposed to giving them $1 more of support and investment than we give to people who aren't on that path, let alone an extra $200 billion of support versus nothing. And so that failure, I think, is an enormous one, and the thing that it links to, and maybe the place where we most strongly agree, is on the importance of marriage and family as a foundation for a liberal society. And I think Richard has written very well about this. In a world where we have deprived young men of the clear, established, reliable pathway to a family-supporting job, the ensuing collapse of marriage and child-rearing and so forth, which in turn provided incredible benefits to men as they progress in their lives, goes away to an enormous extent. Young people between 18 and 34 are more likely to be living at home with their parents than on their own with a significant other at
Can
this
I ask
point.
a factual question here?
Can I jump in? And I want to ask a question. And because I think part of this argument is about whether the problem with liberalism is philosophical or is it really economic and sociological. And when you think of the triumph of liberal pluralism, it coincided with what the French called, and everybody adopted, the 30 glorious years. The 30 glorious years were a time of broad consensus between Christian Democrats, broadly speaking, and those kinds of conservatives, and social democrats on a particular kind of economy. There were two aspects of it. One, it was a relatively egalitarian economy that left out some people, notably in the United States, black people until civil rights. And it was, in the United States, a period of very low immigration, and that we have to take into account how patterns of immigration changed quite radically and also changed in Europe. And I really appreciated Maria's point about how economic disruption has had comparable effects. And when you talk about even the social democratic countries have run into some of these problems, they did, but their own welfare states were reduced a lot in that period. There was the third way period, which, by the way, Tony Judt wrote about very eloquently. So my question is really to Charles, are we really talking about a problem of liberal pluralism has the wrong ideas, or are we talking about a series of changes that altered the ground on which it stood, and that those are primarily the cause, and how does that interact with the ideas?
Well, okay, so let me answer this quite simply, and this may sharpen the distinction between or myself or Maria and myself too. I think right ideas, wrong policies. How about that? So that, but I think liberals have figured this out. I mean, the lesson of the Trump years was that these issues had to be addressed. And I think there are a set of policies among liberals in the United States that are seeking to address them. What has happened, though, in the meantime, a whole set of other ideas have flooded into the right. And those ideas now are driving politics, I think, as much as the economics.
So let me try and pull this together. I mean, this institution has done a lot of work on these issues. Belle Sawhill, my colleague Fiona Hill, has tried to synthesize them in her book, Ill Fares the Land, right? There is a great deal of American reception, for example, of German sort of work and educational systems, right? That have worked very well, and some of which have been transferred to America. Yes?
Okay, I think there's a great concrete example.
Yeah.
Who here supports tracking?
Tracking of what?
Tracking in high school.
Fracking or tracking?
Tracking.
What is
Tracking.
tracking?
We're going to, by
Sorry.
9th or 10th grade, we're going to work with families to identify whether kids are on a college track or not. And if they are, they're going to be in one set of classes. And if not, we're going to start preparing them to move into an apprenticeship at age 18.
I think I want to be Bill Clinton and say it depends on what the meaning of tracking is.
I just told you what it was. Because just to be clear, that is the prerequisite to the success of the German system. You survey American parents on whether they support that. Middle-class American parents support that 95% to 5%. It is the most lopsided result I've ever gotten in our years of public opinion surveying. And yet, in a room like this, that does not fit with our liberal ideas.
All right. I have a significant problem now, which is that my head is full of responses and questions, and I'm sure so is yours. We could go on for hours, but I do want to give the audience a right of response or to ask questions. And I suspect that our colleague Bill Galston, let me just say that we ordinarily, when we do these lectures, have started to invite the lecturer a few days in advance for what we call drinks and drafts. which is where the lecturer brings his first draft or her first draft. We sit down, and yes, we have a drink. Okay, we had some non-alcoholic ones this time, but we're Europeans, so we have a right to be decadent, to quote Raymond Aron, and sort of go through it with him. And Charles very kindly subjected himself to this. And this was the very first time that one of the colleagues whom we invited to join us actually sent us a written response. That was Bill Gostin, whom EJ has already referred to. That's unique in our experience. So I feel, Bill, that you should at least be given the chance to make some of your points at this point, if you'd like. I'm not forcing you to. Bill Gostin of the Governance Department.
Well,
Yep.
I'm deeply grateful not only for that invitation, but also for EJ's generous invocation, of those written comments. It does seem to me, however, that I've already had an opportunity, to, discuss some of these issues with Charles at very great length, and I suspect strongly that there are other people here, who would very much value the opportunity to do the same thing. So, expecting that I'll have many more opportunities, to do this privately or in other groups, I will respectfully yield to the rest of the room.
That's very modest of you, Bill. I think that's the first time in my life that I've ever seen anybody, when given a microphone, decline it. So you deserve an award for that. That is unheard of, and I think you need to be celebrated for that. So, to you, who has questions, please, sir. And if you would, make it a question and say, identify yourself.
Bob Lieber, Emeritus Professor at Georgetown University, a colleague of Charles, whom I hired. Good work.
Nice.
PhD seminar or murder board is right on the button. There's a lot. Let me just focus on one thing. It meant to be a question. I wonder if Charles has, while he touched on it, underplayed the threat from the left. If one thinks of the intellectual climate in universities, if one thinks of the demonstrations on college campuses and the profoundly illiberal implications of it, if one throws in the virulent anti-Semitism that's been part of it, including, by the way, participated in enthusiastically by some women on the left, again, I wonder if Charles really needs to punch up that side of it. He's certainly right. I have no disagreement about the views of the right, but this comes back to the issue of whether the threat is symmetrical or asymmetrical.
Just briefly on that issue. I do think, and Bill, these were part of your comments at the seminar about the asymmetrical nature of this. And again, I mentioned Fukuyama's argument that threat from the right is political. If there is a threat on the left, it's cultural. Bob, you and I have had about 30 years of conversations about exactly this issue in one form or another. This is another moment where I think even the progressive left has the ability to reform itself, and it has the ability to have conversations about ways in which its actions may run counter to the very values that it claims. And I see in university after university, cultural institution after cultural institution, real conversations about this, like a real effort at dialogue. Much as I was trying to argue, I think liberal pluralists are doing the same thing at the moment. If we're at the sort of level of philosophy or analysis, one thing that I think has changed with my students, as I've seen it over the years, coming from high schools, and this may speak to Oren's point about schooling, I see them come in with really two tools for understanding the world, like two tools. One is oppression, and the other is resistance. And what bothers me is that if those are your only kind of tools of analysis, and if those tools of analysis are then strengthened kind of at university, because that you carve up the world in that way. I do worry about the ability of young people to understand the world in more complex ways. But I mean, as you and I have had many conversations about this, I don't think the threat is the same, even on a cultural level.
All right. Do any of you want to respond? All right. More questions? That can't be possible. Please, sorry.
Hi, I'm Zach Schneider. I'm a student at Georgetown doing my master's in democracy and governance. I'm also working with Ukraine Congress Committee. So a lot of these issues bleed both in domestic and foreign policy realms. There was a moment in your lecture where you talked about the reinvigoration of the kind of reinvigoration of the liberal world. And taking a class right now on Berlin and Shklar, they seem very dated. But thinking from a both domestic and foreign policy perspective, potentially even in Ukraine, what are kind of the seeds of a reinvigoration of the liberal ethos that you think could be learned from, particularly from Eastern Europe, but perhaps from other areas and other corners of the world?
That's a really great question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's a terrific question.
I will take the second one, and then I will let, I think, all of us respond and tie this together. Sir.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Paul Hodorkovsky from Hodorkovsky Foundation, US. Charles, in your original remarks in the beginning, you mentioned the possible reboot, I guess, of the liberal pluralism, perhaps as a competing ideology to the two outer centers that we see today. Successful ideologies would, in my mind, require symbols, icons, martyrs, to successfully take root in the society. That would perhaps run counter to the idea of pluralism as itself. How could that conflict be resolved for this ideology to be able to compete successfully with the ones we have today?
Thank you. Also a great question. I do want to note that, as is so often the case, only men have asked questions. Should there be an inclination in this group to change that, this would be the moment, or forever, etc. All right. Seems like not. You can still interrupt. But I'm going to I think we're going to go backwards. I'm going to let Maria start, then Oren, then EJ, and then Charles. Although the questions were directed at you, I think you all get a right response. Maria.
Thank you. I will talk of the interconnection between foreign policy and domestic politics. It's a great question. Thank you for mentioning Ukraine, who we all, I'm sure, support. I think that the war has demonstrated, actually, once again, some of the false premises on which liberalism and the liberal international world order has been based on. Specifically, I'm talking of this overarching power of economy, right? That was the major premise, and Berlin actually criticizes it as well already in his essay, where we believe that economic interconnectedness is just going to make us all equally interdependent and peaceful, which is the basic premise of many of the liberal thinkers, which unfortunately not just not work out in case of Russia, but actually it turns out that Putin was liberal in the sense that he thought that our dependence on his economic resources will constrain us. That's why he started the war in Ukraine in the first place. He thought the EU will not act. So unfortunately, that means that many of those premises did not work out. We are very much back to the hostile realist world, and I also talk about how actually ideas in foreign politics, specifically the very particular set of ideas, let's put it nicely, of the Russian leadership, which is inherited from the Soviet times, but also somewhat biased even further by subsequent developments in the 1990s, Russia's own failure of transition and incorporation into the globalized, modernized world have all contributed to the current horrible status quo. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, I think we're not just facing a new Cold War, but honestly, in my opinion, it's just the same old Cold War that resurfaced. It's never stopped. In the first place, we just mistakenly assumed that during this triumphalist period of the end of history, which unfortunately was, well, as great as it was based on many, many false premises. Lessons from Ukraine, I think, well, first of all, that's certainly the reality that we are still back in that old world where ideologies fight, and Russia is desperately right now trying to come up with its own ideologies, type of ideology. I have a couple of publications on that recently. I don't think they will succeed just because they're also a victim of that same broader victory of liberalism. They don't really have an alternative. It's very clear, but they're trying. On Ukraine, though, I think that we can all learn about how courage, resilience, fantastic creativity that Ukrainian army has demonstrated on the ground right now for this recent incursion into Kursk, but definitely not just that, will hopefully give us lessons. And talking to my EU colleagues, they're actually quite excited about Ukraine joining the European Union. They believe that Ukraine, with all that it has to offer, and this like belief in many of the liberal ideas that we kind of somewhat disenchanted with, will help reinvigorate the liberal order, hopefully going forward.
Thank you, Maria. It's great.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with a point of agreement for once, which is the well, I think the point about there being no real alternative to liberalism and the sort of ideas of liberalism being right is exactly right. And this is something I argue with someone like Patrick Deneen about all the time. The post-liberalism as a critique of liberalism is very interesting. There's no there on what to do instead. And so protecting and resurrecting the liberal project, I think, is one that we all share, and generally over 90+% of Americans probably share. Where I think something gets lost, and the right ideas, wrong policies framing fascinates me, because it's almost like we must need another step in between somehow. There's some sort of translation.
That's also what they said about Marxism and communism, right?
There's some translation step of small L liberalism we all want, but what does that actually produce in the real world? And for me, it seems to me what we lost is the recognition that trade-offs are real. I think a real problem of the sort of particularly post-Cold War model was this idea that everything is win-win and we grow the pie and everybody benefits. And I think, and this is the premise of my book, is that the idea that as long as everyone consumes enough, they'll be happy, and therefore we can compensate the losers with government programs of some sort, is just wrong. That the actual functional social contract is one where everyone has a role as a producer and a full member of the society and a contributor to it. And it's funny, I only realized this right at the end. The term I use as our goal is productive pluralism, which I hope Charles would accept as a good faith rather than manipulated meaning of the term. But the idea that the pluralism that we've lost in the model that we pursued and that we need to recover is one in which everybody, whatever their aptitudes, wherever they are in the country, whatever their view of the good life, can go and actually build that life and find a job and be able to support themselves and their family in that life. And the model of pluralism that I think we've focused on did not actually enable that. It actually eroded that sharply. And it is going to require us to grapple a lot more trade-offs. And this is where things like globalization, like immigration, like an education system that tries to get everybody into college, these things, although we like them as connected to our small L liberal values, I do think conflict with what we have to achieve if we're going to preserve the liberal system. And so my hope and focus is on finding a way to have a liberalism that accepts that those trade-offs exist and make concessions relative to what those who really won under the under the former order might prefer, in pursuit of a model that may be a little less liberal in some respects, but is a lot more sustainable.
So I want to say a couple of things. One, first, I am really grateful for Maria's work, because to understand the problem we are confronting, we really do have to understand what happened in Eastern Europe. And I think it's partly a kind of doctrinaire market liberalism that began to get us into trouble and that the Eastern Europe has become a center of this illiberalism, and we better understand it and link it up. Second, whenever I read Orrin, and now that I've had the pleasure of listening to him, I sort of want to say, oh, come on, read the last 10 years of what Tony Judt wrote and become a social democrat. Join us. It's not that difficult. It's kind of a nice place. And it is an effort, actually. I think social democracy is an effort to correct liberalism. The third thing I want to say is probably, I can't tell whether I was really, really wrong or really, really right, but you could argue one of the wrongest things I ever wrote was after the fall of communism, after the fall of the wall. It was either late 1989 or 1990. And I had fun quoting Orwell saying, actually, this is going to be the victory of social democracy, I wrote. And for a brief period after a kind of third way-ish social democracy actually triumphed quite broadly, that piece doesn't look as persuasive today as it did then. And I think that goes to some of these structural issues that we are talking about. And so when Charles writes this book, which we want him to write, I think there are two things that I want him to do. One is not in the lecture. The other is in the lecture. The thing that's not in the lecture is to grapple with this policy because policy comes out of philosophy, and I think there were some wrong turns there that were perhaps philosophical as well as in policy, and I want him to think about that. And I really want to hear your thoughts on immigration, because I think that's a conundrum we have to grapple with. What I don't want you to give up is the energy of your call for a kind of energy and a realization that liberal pluralism is still a revolutionary idea. It is hard to pull off in ethnically and racially pluralist societies, but it changed the world for the good, and your defense of it is important, and that's why we want you to write the book.
Well, thanks very much, EJ, and all the panelists. I've learned so much in listening to all of you. Just a final thought in response to these last two questions. Two final thoughts. First of all, I know the right ideas, wrong policy can apply to lots of different dimensions, but we're in, and I know you were joking about Marx, who I think had plenty of really right ideas, but we're in a moment where we're also facing wrong ideas, wrong policy, right? Bad ideas, terrible, horrible ideas, and horrible policy, and we shouldn't underestimate that. Secondly, just on Eastern Europe, it is worth remembering that the collapse of tyranny in that part of the world began with an organization not called freedom or not called liberty, yes, but an organization called Solidarity. And to the degree that I think contemporary liberals, and this may speak to some of Orrin's points as well, that contemporary liberals can revisit that moment and find what it was in that image. You know, a society that was tired of insanity, that was tired of the atomism of communism, actually, not just with communist policies, but the society that had created these atomistic, hyper-individualized, disconnected individuals, because, of course, that was good for a tyrannical state. There is something in that, I think, that contemporary liberals can learn from. And in that way, and a final thought, I would not have predicted that, Orrin, you would be the most Juttian figure on this stage by the end of things, but I think Tony would be very proud.
All right. Well, the moderator, I'm sorry, has a couple of thoughts. I would like to point out that what you've just said, Maria, about Central Eastern Europe is reflected in a microcosm in Eastern Germany right now, where the future of German politics is currently being decided, right? And one of the lessons to learn, certainly from the German experience, is just how Germans misread the 1989-90 moment, how German liberals got it wrong, right? And the damage that neoliberalism did in the Eastern German states. But I think we also need to acknowledge that the liberalism, that the core tenets of liberalism that we here, I think, all cherish, has real enemies today. And that is also something that is new about this moment. And the enemies, and some of you have heard me say this before, are Schmittians, right? They have a theory of the case, and it is the opposite in key aspects of liberalism, and it is inimical to the human dignity that we cherish. Finally, I think I'm glad to see that we agree that the really hard problems of liberalism reside not in the philosophy, the politics, the policy, but really in structural questions. That's where the hard problems are, and that's what ultimately we have to be able to solve, right? And finally, I really like Oren's point about the trade-offs. I would go one step farther and say, and that was kind of what I was trying to get at in my sort of, struggling in the fog way earlier. I think beyond trade-offs, we also may have to make sacrifices. And we may have to make sacrifices to preserve our liberties, but sacrifice rooted in the spirit of solidarity. I think that's the challenge of the age to me, right? And I will leave it there and say thank you, Charles, for an absolutely terrific lecture which absolutely, confirmed our faith in you. Thank you to our three panelists, EJ, Diane, Maria Snegovaya, and Oren Cass, for joining us this morning. I thought this was terrific, really inspiring, really rich and meaty, and I think stuff for many other discussions. I want to thank the audience for coming and sticking with us here in the room and online. And finally, my colleagues who make this all possible. Ted Reinert, who is the Associate Director of the Center on the US and Europe over there, Caroline Grasmuck over there, the Center Coordinator, and Sophie Rosa, whom I am currently not seeing, who is somewhere off typing, thank you. But honestly, this is the best job I've ever had. It's the best center with the best colleagues in the best institution. So keep on following us. This will continue. And thank you all. Have a wonderful Friday and weekend.